Good afternoon and welcome to ARC's Literacy Webinar Series. I'm Amelia Larson and I serve as the EVP of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. ARC is an organization founded by and run by educators in pursuit of love, literacy, and liberty. Our work is designed to help create the types of schools where all students are served well and thrive. We draw specific attention to the needs of students from historically marginalized and underserved groups by creating a sense of belonging and safety and engaging them in high levels of literacy work that honors their intellect, culture, and communities. A few housekeeping items. Closed caption has been enabled for those who would like a live transcript. We are recording today's session and hope to share it with all of you, unless there are technical issues. You will receive an email in a few days with resources from this webinar, as well as information about our upcoming webinars. We have an incredible lineup for you. I encourage you to join the conversation through the chat feature. If you have questions, continue to post them in the chat, and we will get to them as we can. Now, without further interruption, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Sarah Lupo is an assistant professor in the early elementary and reading department at James Madison University. Her research focuses on exploring the influence of various aspects of text complexity on readers' comprehension, like knowledge, and how instruction can be differentiated to support all readers' understanding of challenging texts across the content areas. David Lieben is a dear, close friend. He's a nationally recognized reading expert who is uniquely able to translate research on the brain and reading into practical applications for teachers and students. Prior to being involved with the Common Core state standards and helping educators in all settings make shifts they needed to do so in order for students to thrive, David taught and led schools at all grade levels during a 35-year school-based career. Thank you for your service. I speak for everyone at ARC when I say we're delighted to have you join our conversation, connecting research to practice, making science of reading more than a movement. The science of reading movement has really been successful in raising awareness about research that supports students' reading development. Yet, with such success, tactical questions remain. More recently, a group of some of the most highly respected reading researchers associated with the New Knowledge Matters campaign called on the science of reading movement to expand its focus to include the role of knowledge and the role that it plays in literacy. Well, how can educators utilize all the guidance brought forth and put it into practice in a coherent instructional system that serves all students, all children well? Before we start, I'm going to remind us of the call to action included in the Reading League's Science of Reading Defining Guide. They called us, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see this. The last time we finished our webinar with this slide, and we're starting with it today. They call for us to be good citizens of a science and practice community by engaging in these behaviors. So I'm going to ask all of us to attend to this call to action. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with you today, David. When you think about everything that is going on, how are you showing up today? What are your best hopes and what is keeping you up at night?
Thanks, Amelia. With the science of reading, my concerns, I don't know if they're keeping me up at night. A lot of things might be keeping me up at night at my age. But I worry that the science of reading is becoming extremely reductionist. It's being considered phonics. If you do phonics, you're doing the science of reading. A number of years ago, not that long, it was considered that if you did, for example, that if you used decodables, you would go to hell, and your children would become serial killers. Now there are some people who think that if you don't use decodables, you will go to hell, and your children will become serial killers. So this seesawing back and forth is it's not terribly helpful. So I'm worried that people don't understand that there's a cognitive science behind reading, not only for phonics, but for fluency, for vocabulary, for syntax, for knowledge, and for comprehension itself, by the way. A guy named Walter Kent just opened up a whole new field to understand actually what does it mean in the mind to understand the text. So it's much more than just phonics, and it's more than just phonics and even knowledge. So that's I'd say that's one of my biggest worries. My other worry is I think schools need to use a program. I've yet to see a school that can help all the children we need to help that do not have a core ELA program that has been reviewed and analyzed as a high quality program. So those are my two things. There's a few other things that keep me up at night, but I don't know if they're appropriate for right now.
Sounds good. Sarah, what about you?
Thanks so much. It's great to be here today. I'm showing up today as a literacy professor, and I think that that plays a significant role in this conversation because schools of education have certainly played a role and continue to play a role in the science of reading movement and the training of teachers. I do also have 14 years of full-time experience as a teacher, and that's part of who I am, and it's part of the research I do, and it's part of how I show up. And I've been an ESL teacher, an ELA teacher, a reading specialist. I've worked with kindergartners all the way through high schoolers, much of that time with children who had some serious struggles with learning how to read and write. And so that my hope and what I just wish for every day is that all children are strong readers and writers, because I think it gives them more choices in life. And that to me is why I do what I do and why I show up and why I want to help with this. What keeps me up at night is similar to David. A lot of teachers lack resources to provide strong and coherent literacy instruction, and that really concerns me. And it concerns me because we have a lot of good resources and a lot of good curriculum that are out there. And I have the pleasure of getting to visit lots of classrooms and work with lots of teachers. And I see teachers working really, really hard and creating and reinventing the wheel, when actually we have a curriculum that could do that, and the teacher could spend that time just adjusting that curriculum to meet their learners' needs, which I think would be a much better use of their time. It would be much easier, and I think the instruction would actually be much stronger as a result of that. And so that's one thing that keeps me up at night. And then I have similar concerns that have been mentioned too about the science of reading movement. On the one hand, I'm really excited that reading is getting the attention it needs, and we're getting a revamp and a revisit to some of the practices in schools that really need to go away. And we're thinking about these practices that truly will be more equitable in supporting all of our readers. And I think one of the reasons that the movement has become so popular is because the message is quite simple. But I do think that, as David mentioned, it's almost oversimplified sometimes, and I worry that we're removing some of the nuance to make the message simple and easy to understand. And that nuance is really important. And I think it's really particularly important for our learners that come from marginalized backgrounds. And so we need to be really, really considerate of making sure that we're not oversimplifying the science to understand it. And we're not taking away that nuance that we need to really support everybody.
Well, thank you so much. What a powerful way to get started. And I wanted to ask Sarah, I'm going to start with you. What exactly is the science of reading to you?
Sure. Well, if you wouldn't mind sharing the next slide. Yes, that one. I think that the Reading League definition is a really great starting place for understanding the science of reading. And so as I'm helping the teachers that I work with and the students that I work with, many of whom are pre-service teachers and have not heard of this yet, I use this as a starting place. And I think this is a great starting place for understanding that the science of reading is this really large body of what they call scientific evidence that goes well beyond just education research, but looks at psychology and all kinds of different backgrounds. We're not even just looking at reading research that happened in learning how to read in English, but in multiple languages, which I think is really important. And this body of evidence informs how reading and writing develops for readers, as well as what we need to do instructionally to support readers, and what we might do when it isn't developing so well for some of our readers. I think that an important caveat of this definition, though, is in how the Reading League defines scientific evidence. What is the science of reading? Well, what is science is a really important question to ask here. What are you counting as science? What counts as research and evidence? And their definition is experimental or quasi-experimental studies, which we think of as quantitative research. So that's numbers. So testing kids, giving them a reading assessment and seeing if it worked. As well as, and I agree with these bottom 2 points, descriptive enough studies that we could replicate it, try it again with different students and get similar results. And it needs to be peer reviewed. So experts have reviewed it and agreed that this meets rigorous standards. But that first bullet point, I would like to push back a little bit on and broaden that. I think that qualitative research is really important, and qualitative research is interviewing students and teachers, asking them about how it went and what went well, observing the instruction that happened and looking at things that maybe won't show up in those test scores. And I think this is particularly important for some of our more marginalized populations. We need to understand not just did it work, but who did it work for, when did it work for them, and under what conditions did it work? And that's why we need that qualitative piece. So I like that definition, but I'd add the qualitative research as well.
Thank you. I always say it's good to know what works. It's better to know how to make it work, right?
Yep.
David, anything that you would like to add?
Not really, only that since it's science, it's not static. New things come along, and we haven't been too good at it's difficult sometimes to bring those into practice. Like, for example, with phonemic awareness, David Kilpatrick has brought out, he has not done that research himself, as he says right on, but he's pointing to research done as far back as, well, I don't know, at least 20 years, showing the role of phoneme manipulation as opposed to phoneme blending and segmenting, sometimes called advanced phonemic awareness, sometimes called phoneme manipulation, especially in relation to the weakest readers. So when something comes out, whether the research is new or whether someone has brought out this research to the world, that's part of the science of reading. And Robert Seidenberg, I forget his first name, Mark Seidenberg has said that in all of his recent work as well, he being a cognitive scientist.
Now, David, when we think about the definition, recently I talked a little bit about the statement from the Scientific Advisory Committee that Knowledge Matters campaign brought together. What do you think this can, well, first, what are they calling for? And what do you think it can add to the conversation?
Well, they're calling for the inclusion of knowledge in the science of reading, which, and it, as I said earlier, it's definitely part, but as with everything else, by itself, it's not complete. I think the statement will be helpful. I think what will be much more helpful is the website that has that just came on a couple of weeks ago, showing high quality programs that have scientifically based foundational skills instruction, that have knowledge, and that have equitable access to complex text and to growing knowledge. And there's 6 programs there that you can get a feel for each of them. You can see what they look like. And there's links that you can go further with to see them even more. I think that'll be way more helpful than the statement. Although I agree with the statement. I just think that the website and what's there could be super helpful to districts trying to make a shift now. And more districts are now trying to make a shift.
And I am going to ask my partners to put the site, the Knowledge Matters campaign, on the chat, and also when it's going to be included in your follow-up. I am going to start with you, Sarah, on this. Recently, the Language magazine helped to bring together a roundtable with top people. And a major takeaway from the discussion was that even though the invited group of participants agreed on equitable and asset-based instruction for multilingual learners, they found that the discussion on teaching them literacy skills was still primarily predicated on literacy instruction for English monolingual students. What do you want people to ask, to think about, to consider when it comes to emerging bilinguals, multilingual learners?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's a really important question to ask, especially when we're talking about the science of reading. And this is why I do think that the qualitative research is helpful. We need to be looking at the studies and say, were there language learners included here? And I recently did a review of some research on early phonics instruction. And my co-authors and I found that much of the time, the participant's background wasn't reported at all. So I find that a little bit concerning when we're adopting these practices for everyone, and we don't know who this research worked for. We don't know who the participants were. We don't know if they were language learners, if they had different dialects, if they were learning English in different ways. And I think that's really important. And I think that matters a lot. And so that's why I really think that we need to be paying attention to who is in the research that we're examining. But more so, I would ask, has the curriculum or the research or the pedagogical approach that you're enacting or being asked to teach, has that actually been piloted with multi-language learners? And if not, what kinds of supports might those students need to develop literacy? What might you need to add and adapt to your curriculum or your pedagogical approach to make sure that it is lining up with how multilingual learners learn? And I think that I'd also just want to remind folks that a lot of multilingual learners have really strong literacy skills in their home language, and those literacy skills actually transfer over to English. And so we don't need to reteach those things. And I do see language learners in some places being pulled out of classrooms out of the really good, rich knowledge building instruction. And instead they're being given like a low-level phonemic awareness or even a low-level phonics intervention, when actually they may actually have those skills in their first language, and those skills would transfer over. But we assessed them in English. And if you assessed my literacy skills in Russian, I would not look very literate. I would look like I need phonemic awareness instruction and phonics instruction because I don't know how to read that language. But I wouldn't need the same things as someone who actually is illiterate. I would need some different things because I bring those literacy skills from my first language. And so we don't need to teach those things. We want to make sure we're balancing the high quality instruction, but also meeting their needs and understanding and looking at our evaluations and saying, we assess them in English. They may know more than we know. And I always like to remind folks that America is the only place in the world that I've found where we treat the knowledge of a second language as a deficiency rather than a strength. I spent a lot of time traveling, and I'd go to other places and they'd be like, you only know one language? Like, that's so weird. And in America, we treat people who know another language in our schools as deficient. And we have to remember that that's a huge strength that they're bringing to the table, is this knowledge of another language. And so we need to treat that as such.
And I want to make sure that people understand what you're saying. You are not saying that kids that are emergent bilinguals don't benefit from the research on the science of reading, but what you are saying is we must be careful in how we assess them, because we are holding them back due to language issues. We might be slow walking them through school. So I think that's really important. Now, David, I'm going to start with you. To what do you attribute the endless reading wars? Shouldn't we be agreeing on more things? How can we bring people together, people that need to be involved in the solution?
Okay, let me just go back to the language issue just very quickly.
Yes, absolutely.
In our school, pulling kids out and taking them, as Sarah said, away from the curriculum is really demotivating. In our school, we would have kids who they were pulled out because we had to. It was a district rule or something, and you can't break every freaking rule, although we tried. And then those kids got demotivated essentially. And what happened was a really interesting phenomenon. They passed the reading test and they didn't pass the English language test. So it became patently absurd. Why are they getting this? At that point in New York City, 30% of the kids were passing the state assessment. We had these kids who were passing the state assessment, and they're saying they have to go into English, to be pulled out for ELL instruction. So because of the reading test, we did get them out of that. But I just want to emphasize the importance of not keeping them in with everybody else is really harmful to their social and emotional development. Okay, the reading wars. Well, first of all, we wouldn't have reading wars if everything was working okay. You know, if everybody's reading on grade level or something like grade level, and it's equitable, different groups, different socioeconomic groups, different ethnic groups, then, you know, unless Vladimir Putin was the Secretary of Education, we wouldn't have a freaking reading war. So it's important to understand that it's connected to not getting the outcomes that we want. So why do we have these outside of that? It's not a quick or easy answer. Schools of education have not been teaching for quite a long time about the science of reading. The whole knowledge thing, nobody even talked about that until after the standards. I mean, almost nobody. Almost. Nell Duke talked about informational text before the standards, but it was not part of future teachers' education at all. So that's certainly part of the problem. But on the other hand, there was a very interesting thing that called a natural experiment when you don't actually set it up, but in essence, it is an experiment. The high-powered charter schools, KIPP, Achievement Network, Achievement First, and a couple of others, had tended to have very good reading scores. And then the standards came out and the assessments became more rigorous, and they were half informational text, meaning that you have to have some knowledge to read informational text. And all of a sudden, all of the kids from those schools dropped precipitously. To their credit, those charter schools went about really trying to fix that. But what happened? Those teachers did not go to traditional colleges of education. They tended to go to schools set up in some cities by the charter networks, and their kids did no better than anybody else. So it's not only the schools of education, it's certainly part of the problem, but that's not all the problem. What else you could look at? I mean, hell, you could go all the way back to Rousseau. Rousseau basically was the philosopher who believed in the organic nature of human development, that kids should learn naturally, learn in a structureless, more free environment. And that doesn't work for all kids, especially with foundational skills. But that philosophy, I think he's one of the guys up on the above the entrance to Teachers College. That philosophy clearly influenced instruction for a long time. And this last thing, I'll bet you nobody here has ever heard of, maybe Sarah, and that's San Antonio versus Rodriguez, 1973. That was the Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court, in all its infinite wisdom, which it's even surpassed now, declared that, in fact, an equal opportunity to education, meaning the idea that the resources that are put into public schools should not be contingent upon the income or wealth level of the district, that the Constitution can't say anything about that, that's completely constitutional by a 5-4 margin. Now, one swing vote would have changed history in a lot of ways, because as we all know, that's another problem. The districts that we need that need the most help have far less resources. And as far as the Supreme Court was concerned in 1973, they're good with that. So that you could go back to that too. But that's another whole book that needs to be written. Maybe you'll write it, Sarah. I'm already working. I'm working on my second book with my wife, so I can't write that.
David, I'm gonna, okay, I was gonna ask you to adjust your camera because half of your head was cut off.
Oh, well, you know what? Was that the good half or the bad
half? Sarah, is there anything you want to add to this conversation about the reading wars?
Sure. And I'd love to write that book, David, but you're gonna have to write it with me. And I hadn't heard of it until you had mentioned that court case. And I was glad you had brought it up, because I think about it a lot as I work with different districts, and the differences in resources is astounding from district to district. And I think that it's not equitable. And that's something we have to think about, how we're funding our schools. It's really important. I would add a little bit to that. I can add some perspectives as someone in teacher preparation, helping prepare future and current teachers to be good teachers. And I would say that I would call it more uneven teacher training in our country. I see a lot of different types of outcomes happening with different students. And so, I do teach teachers, and I start tomorrow actually with my students for the semester. And I actually gave a survey this week. I always give a survey before we start classes, and I ask them, what do you know about literacy instruction and how to teach, and what do you need to learn? And one of my classes, I teach a capstone course, so they're getting their third literacy class after 2 previous courses, and I see really varying answers. Some of them are like super strong on many things and they have all this knowledge, and others are really unsure. And I think that one of the reasons for that, they've all taken the same courses. We're pretty consistent in our instruction. There might be inconsistencies if we have to have adjuncts and whatnot, and that's definitely a problem in higher ed sometimes, but I think that we're pretty consistent. But what's really different for them is their placements and what they're seeing happening in schools. And so I think that one of the issues that we have is that we don't have enough connection between this research and practice. And what I'm teaching in my classes, my students have often told me is really different than what they're seeing. And it's really hard for them to understand the science of reading. I can't teach it if what they go and see in schools is completely opposite of what I'm teaching them and what I'm telling them. And so I actually think that what we need is more partnerships between universities and schools, between curriculum developers and universities and schools, and community organizations like ARC. I think this is the answer, that we're all kind of operating in our silos, and we need to come together and make sure that we're providing more consistent training for our teachers.
Thank you. So moving on now, I really want to talk about what is settled, what is rock solid evidence, and what is unsettled about teaching foundational skills. Once that's where we see most of the explosive debates. So I am going to start with you, Sarah, and then go to David.
Sure. Well, I want to push back a little bit on the word settled first.
Okay.
I understand what you mean, and that what the field means when we talk about settled research versus unsettled. But I think that we have to remember that sometimes what we see in research is what I would call promising. And so there's research that we have that indicates that like this is a really promising approach and we should probably try it. And that's really different than like the brain research that we know is what we call settled. Like we know that this is how the brain operates, but that's really different often than instructional methods that we teach. And so what I sometimes see happen is we're picking up, an instructional way of thinking about the brain, and then we're trying to use that as in our instruction. It just doesn't always work quite that way. But one thing I will say is that we do know how reading develops for children who develop reading in a developmentally normal way. And so if you could share that slide, Amelia. And I think this needs to be common knowledge for all students. I think that we need to look at Aries stages, and all students should walk away from their teacher preparation programs with a really strong understanding of how reading develops. And I don't have every single thing here in this slide, but just as an example, I need to know if I have a pre-alphabetic reader who understands maybe how to use pictures to understand a story, but maybe only knows a couple names of letters at most and nothing else, versus whether or not I have a consolidated alphabetic reader walking into my classroom who is trying to learn how to read more complex patterns and maybe knows how to blend and segment some sounds, but is still developing that ability to read most of the words automatically. And so I think this is a really important piece of information that I think that teachers need to really have. And when I started working with teachers in schools, I got in there and they want to talk about reading levels, and reading levels doesn't have a strong research backing, and it doesn't have any real research backing, honestly. And reading stages do. And so this is a much more helpful approach. And I always say, like, if we're going to talk about what not to do, we have to talk about what to do instead. And I think Aries stages is like, let's stop talking about reading levels and let's instead talk about stages and think about what readers know at each stage, what they're learning, so that we can be really aware of what our expectations are for students. If I know that this student is a full alphabetic reader, I'm not going to expect them to be able to read a lot of words automatically because they're still learning how to do that. They're going to be pretty laboriously sounding things out. And so someone asked where the slide is. It should be on the screen. I can see
Yeah,
it.
it should be on the screen.
But we need to understand what our readers can do, and using stages is much more helpful for that.
So
Oh,
I'm so glad you're talking about the phases of Aries phases of word reading development, and like also the span of time that it takes for them to go all the way from pre-alphabetic to consolidated or automatic. One of the things that we often have to clarify for people, even with ARC Core, is like K5 ARC Core, which is our core curriculum, knowledge building curriculum that includes knowledge building, foundational skills, and access to complex texts. That is K5. That includes grade level instruction. But our assessment and our interventions go pre-K to or to 12, right? Because you are not going to limit kids. And I think sometimes people get confused. All kids need access to grade level instruction, but they also need differentiation to meet them where they are.
I agree. And that's why I think understanding reading stages is so important. I can look at my curriculum and I can assess my students and figure out, all right, I've got this many that are consolidated, this many that are full alphabetic. I've got a couple pre-alphabetic readers in my first grade classroom. What am I going to do? I'm going to look at my curriculum, and now I'm not going to not teach my curriculum that I have. I'm going to teach my first grade curriculum if I'm a first grade teacher, but I'm going to keep in mind the fact that I've got some students who are going to need some really serious supports to be able to do this, and a little bit of additional instruction that might not be in that core curriculum I have. Whereas I've got these other students who they're going to fly through this and they're going to need a little more. And that's why I think the stages is so helpful. Not that we want to like only teach within the stages, but we need to be able to assess our materials and figure out what we need to teach. And then I also think what's helpful too in thinking about stages is the type of text that we want to give students. So if you can show that other slide, that would be great. And I think that I think readers need a lot of different kinds of texts. And for some readers at some stages, decodable texts can be one of those kinds of texts. I want to be really clear that the science and this is not really settled on decodables. There actually isn't any research that supports the use of decodables. However, we do know from anecdotal evidence, and I can definitely attest for this myself with my own children and children that I've worked with, that some readers, particularly in that partial and full alphabetic stages, can really develop a lot of confidence if they kind of some access to some of their text being decodable. And I've seen that be really helpful. But we also want to make sure that all of our students, regardless of their stage, have access to complex and easier texts that support knowledge development, that they're engaging with literary fiction that is motivating and interesting and challenging for them, something that's going to make them have to really think, as well as natural text. We want to make sure that not all the text students see have controlled patterns. We want to make sure that they are coming across irregular words and sentences and syntax that are more complex and irregular.
And you know, that also affirms, like ARC has an assessment that truly does help teachers identify the phases that kids are in and coach them forward. We also have a variety of texts, right? At different levels of complexities. And we say to people all the time, don't put the kids in the baskets, just the books, right? So it's important. David, your turn.
I guess what I would add is Sarah's right. There's no absolute research that decodable texts are necessary for proficiency in reading, as opposed to a systematic phonics program, which is necessary for the large majority of kids. But there is some work to show that if you have a text with high decodability, well, first of all, there's no evidence for what's decodable. Is decodable 80% decodable, or is decodable 60%? And some of the research had varied numbers and some had even less. But there is some work showing that if you have a systematic phonics program and you use decodable text, especially very early on for everybody, like ARC has, then those students are more likely to use decoding when they read, because they learned about decoding and they got some text that required them to do decoding. And especially in the early part, in kindergarten and the early part of first grade. That research did not say that the kids should not read anything else. There's no research that I'm aware of to that effect. And in fact, there's two pieces of information that I think are useful as to, well, what do you do with kids if you're reading text that have words with phonics patterns that they have not been taught, or very low frequency phonics patterns that may be patterns, but they have not come across them. Well, work by Donna Scanlon shows that and as Marilyn Adams has said for I don't know how many years, if you teach kids first and foremost to approach words phonetically, because you've got some phonics lessons and you've got some text with high degrees of decodability, and they approach these words phonetically. Then if they don't get it right, it's okay to validate it by using the context. The difference between that and 3Qing is very important. 3Qing, they were all equally important. And really, they weren't equally important with 3Qing. Really, the phonics was the third leg with 3Qing. So if you come to these words and the child can't decode them, but they've tried, then it's okay to use context. And then you go back and map the words. Okay, so if the word was pick and the kid said, well, they weren't quite sure, they knew the initial consonants, but they couldn't figure out that word was pick. It's okay if they used the context to figure it out. Then go back and say, hey guys, what made the is sound, do you think? Did the K make the is sound? No, the I made the is sound. What made that K sound at the end? Well, K, Mr. Lieben, everybody knows K makes a K sound where you go to school. Okay, then what's the C doing there? And then you say, well, in English, a lot of the time, the K sound at the end of a word is made by CK. It's like, you could call it a teachable moment. I don't think, but Seidenberg pointed that out. It doesn't have to be this perfect linear sequence. You can stop and teach the nature of the English language, and using different kinds of text that the high quality materials have, although they don't all have the same amount. ARC does have a good switch of both, is actually a plus and not a minus. So that's really important stuff. And that's in response to Amelia's question. Of course, I forgot Amelia's question, but I think it was so
You answered.
Okay. Then, since I answered it, I better stop there.
Well, I think it's critical here. You mentioned Seidenberg, and what Seidenberg says is that we do teach the code and we have to be explicit, but kids also need the opportunity to practice. It's this balance of direct and indirect implicit learning, he calls it, direct instruction and implicit learning, that we need to find a balance for. But withholding texts from kids is not the way to do it, right? So I think this is really important. We have to read the nuances, like you said, Sarah, like go into Perfetti and Scher and Seidenberg, not just one person, right? I think that's critical. Now, what you guys started talking about led me to think about, what do we know about differentiation? What works and what does not? Sarah, I'll start with you.
Sure. And I just want to say that was a great example, David, of the nuance that we need to pay attention to with the 3Qing system. And why we don't want to oversimplify things. And it's not black or white. It's not this or that. It's under what conditions, and that's what really matters. And I think that's that's sort of a good seg into differentiation, because I think with differentiation, for me, it starts, like I said before, with identifying the stage of reader in my classroom. It's not a black and white thing. People often want like a quick answer to differentiation. Oh, I just do this and I can I had someone tell me once, like, oh, you just give them different texts and that's differentiation. And I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I think it depends on the situation. And so I would say that starting with that stage, thinking about the grade level instruction that they're receiving, looking at your curriculum and what you're going to be providing, and thinking about what do they need that's not here in this curriculum, and what do they need to be able to access and do this curriculum. And that's going to vary from student to student, from teacher to teacher, and from grade level to grade level. And it really just depends on how far behind or how ahead or how in line, and what different resources you have in your classroom and in your building. In some cases, students have, or teachers have, a reading specialist pushing into their reading block. That makes differentiation really easy. You can have a teacher that has a whole group of students that aren't quite, able to do a lot of the things in the curriculum. Well, you can have a small group that reading specialist runs that can give them some of that alphabet practice that perhaps isn't being covered in the curriculum. And so I think that we always want to remember with differentiation that we're always providing that grade level instruction, and that our differentiation is either giving students something they need that aligns with their stage that isn't in our grade level instruction, or it's providing the supports that help them be able to access that grade level instruction. And so I think comprehension supports are a really good example. Our students can read and access really high level text, even in the early grades, with the right scaffolds and supports. And so we just want to make sure to add those. Like with older elementary students, like adding a reading guide that might give them a little bit of background knowledge that they don't have, defining a couple of key vocabulary words that they're unfamiliar with, pointing to a particular sentence and giving them like a real clear direction, like pay attention to this word here, because that's going to come up later and you need to know that. Those are the kinds of scaffolds we can put in place to differentiate, to help our students be able to access these more complex texts and more complex instruction.
And David, before I turn to you, I think it's really important for us to ground this in examples. So let's talk about our incoming kindergartners. Some kids come in with literacy socialization, 2,000 hours of experiences with books, book structures and titles, and other kids do not. They come in without literacy socialization, and they need more than just grade level instruction to catch up. Mm-hmm. They may need to know that print exists and is worth noticing because it has meaning. They may need to know basic print concepts, right? But listen to what Sarah said. This has to happen at the same time that they are receiving grade level instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, and also a wider view of print through read-alouds, content-rich read-alouds, right? So it's not one thing or the other. And she also said, use like shared reading, paired reading when necessary, right? So often we lose the IQ of the room. Thank you so much for Sarah. So important what you're talking about. But David, you wanted to talk a little bit about this and also the importance of practice. So what do you want to add to the conversation around differentiation?
Two things. Differentiation is far more of a problem in practice than in theory. There's very few people, even if you could forget bad language, you could be an absolute whole language fanatic, and you're not going to stand up in front of a group of people and say, no, I'm not going to differentiate. Everybody's going to get the same freaking thing all the time, no matter what. There's not much, I don't believe there's much resistance to that. However, it's way harder to do in practice. It's hard when you've got 25 kids in the room and you've got to make 3 groups, and you've got to figure out what to do with the kids who are not in the group, and what to do with the kids who are in the group. So programs that give support and very specific instructions and make it as usable as possible are very important. I believe all of the programs, including ARC on the Knowledge Matters website, do that, but they don't do that perfectly. And that's something, none of them do that perfectly. And that's something to consider. It's important to respect the difficulty of differentiation as a practice. The other thing is repetition. And this also goes back to what we're talking about, well, what's known and what's not known. There's a lot known about the connection between the role of sounds and curriculum, and that kids need to connect letters to sounds. And that's decoding. And when done right, over a period of time, a word becomes automatic. And as Seidenberg says, when a word is automatic, a mature reader reads that word in 0.23 seconds, regardless of how long it is. But it takes effortful decoding to get to automaticity. No one knows how much repetition some kids need. Some kids need more, others need far more. Some kids need less. Some kids really do need very little, hence differentiation. But no one knows that. No one knows exactly. And so, if you're doing this on your own, which I don't recommend, I do not believe we can bring all the kids we need to help to proficiency by creating our own curriculum completely. Mm-hmm. The 6 curriculums that we've met that are on the Knowledge Matters website, which include ARC, they all have repetition, but you've got to see if that's enough repetition. And ARC has a good deal of repetition because I worked with them to put more in, and they're a good curriculum to work with. Sometimes you have to hit them over the head with a hammer, but at least they then respond after you hit them over the head with a hammer. And that's super important. The weakest readers are very likely going to need more repetition, more practice. And you have to look at your materials to make sure they have that. And if you have no materials, you need to find them to do that. So that was the only other things I wanted to add to that.
So David, we respond to intervention, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you're an RTI publisher. I never thought of it that way.
Now, I do want to leave out comprehension, knowledge building, vocabulary. David, what do we know about it, in particularly the importance of vocabulary and knowledge building?
There's a couple of things we know. We know there's enough research in cognitive science going back, 20 or 30 years. So of course, it never got to instruction at all until the last, it began somewhat after the Common Core standards, because the Common Core standards said half of the text kids need to read to be informational text. So all of a sudden, they have to read text about animals or weather or explorers or whatever. So people said, holy shoot, maybe we should teach them something about the world, because you actually need to know something about the world to be a proficient reader. Who would have thunk? So that didn't really get into the educational world until began in 2014, 2015. Now it's more in the educational world with a lot of help from Natalie Wexler and the standards and student achievement partners. So it's in there more now. It's considered part of the science of reading. The research is there. What's really interesting is 2 things. Well, look, there's a few things actually. And in reference to what we've been discussing, I don't know if anybody remembers Sputnik. Sputnik was when the Russians launched a satellite into space before the Americans, and the American government went berserk. We're all going to be defeated and we're all going to be dead because the Russians launched the Sputnik. And they went to Harvard and they went to cognitive scientists. I don't mean to date anybody, but I remember it. I was 9. It was 1958. They went to cognitive scientists. They went to actually the man who founded the field of cognitive science, named Jerome Bruner. And he put together a group of people to create a 5th grade curriculum as an example. That curriculum, called Man, A Course of Study, MACOS, had what I call the mother of all essential questions, drove that curriculum. What does it mean to be human, and how did we get that way? It integrated science, literacy, and social science to address that question. Well, that was in 1960. So we're 60 years later, and now we're talking about putting knowledge into place. I guess better late than never, but the importance of it and the research is overwhelming. One last thing on it. It turns out that if you want to increase tier 2 vocabulary, the best way to do that is to read texts on a topic, and to do your work connected to a topic, your writing, your discussions, your reading, your trip activities, etc. That maximizes tier 2 vocabulary. All of these programs do that, every single one of them, and they all do it really well.
And also helping multilingual learners to develop the registers of language needed to engage in meaningful debate, but also to write about it for different audiences. David, before I pass it on to Sarah, everybody says that they are a knowledge building curricula. How do you know?
That's a good question. A real knowledge building curriculum has the questions and the activities that direct to the knowledge. The writing, the text dependent questions, the discussions. They also address the nature of the text and how to read the text, but they also address knowledge. There are some places that say the knowledge building curriculum, and they have hardly any questions about the topics being addressed. That's the easiest way to address that. Instead, they have questions all based on comprehension strategies, which is Daniel Willingham and Beck and McCown, the people who gave us tier 1, tier 2, and 3, have clearly shown have very limited utility compared to actually asking questions about the text. What Beck and McCown call content questions, what we as Student Achievement Partners call text-dependent questions. So it turns out that asking kids questions about what's going on in the text and how do they know that is a better way than teaching them all about different kinds of strategies. Questions about the text. Who would have thunk?
And I want to call attention before I pass it on to Sarah that it is critical because the design of knowledge building curricula truly supports the development of language proficiency and content and literacy in multilingual learners. It cannot be like an afterthought call out. It's like equity by design. So check them out. Sarah, what do we know about comprehension, knowledge building, vocabulary?
Well, knowledge is an area that I think the nuance is really important here, and I do see it oversimplified sometimes. And we know that knowledge is really important for reading. We know that students who have knowledge have more vocabulary words are better readers than students who know fewer words. We know that. That's been shown. What's less clear is how we get them there, and what we can do in schools to make sure that they're there. And I do think a knowledge building curriculum is showing a lot of promise, and we certainly want to do that, but we have to be careful how we approach the knowledge building to make sure that we're not just viewing our students as vessels that we want to fill up with knowledge, that we're really understanding what that means to understand and draw knowledge from a text. And David referred earlier to Kinch's model of reading, which I think is a great model. That's a known thing about comprehension and knowledge. And what Kinch says is that real reading comprehension is when you take something from the text and you combine it with your own knowledge, you make it a part of your own knowledge. That integration of your prior knowledge with that new knowledge is essentially what that comprehension is. And then you can take it and apply it to different situations. And I think that we want to remember that piece about combining it with our own knowledge. In doing that, we always want to approach our learners as having knowledge. And so one thing that sometimes concerns me is that we talk about the knowledge gap, and we've assumed that these students don't have any knowledge and they're coming to us and they're I've heard low knowledge students referred to as that. I've never met a student that doesn't have some knowledge. I've met lots of students that their knowledge is not always valued in academic settings. Their knowledge might be very different than what the author has assumed that they know of the textbook that we're reading, but they know something. And we need to make sure to get to that true comprehension that we are figuring out what they know and helping them connect it. And there's lots of unique and interesting ways we can do this. I wrote a unit with some colleagues, and we implemented it in some schools, and it was in a more rural place and students had lots of farming knowledge. And so we thought about how matter changes phases and how can we apply this and use their farm knowledge. And there was a local issue that had been in the paper where well water was being contaminated because of poor farming practices. And we were able to bring students' knowledge about farming practices into the classroom to learn about phase changes of matter. And that's an example of students who had been referred to as low knowledge students, or who would have been referred to as that. The people that I work with would never say that, but in other situations, they would have been referred to as that. And these students had all this knowledge, and we were able to use that to help them understand. And so I think that's really important. And I think that we can use the text that we have to do that. And I also think that we want to remember that knowledge is bigger than just topic knowledge. Amelia, can you share slide 7? I skipped one.
Yes,
so go right.
Absolutely, I can. Wait. I lost it for a second. I am going to share it right now.
My dear friend,
Is this it?
Yes, my dear friend Courtney Hatton has taught me a lot about knowledge. She was my co-author on a piece that we discussed this in. And she taught me to be frustrated when people say background knowledge, but really mean topic knowledge. When we think about background knowledge, it's so much bigger than just like, what facts do they know about the topic that we're reading? Background knowledge includes linguistic knowledge, knowledge of language and how it works. That includes multiple languages that you might know how they work. It includes conditional knowledge, which is understanding when and how to use these different types of knowledge that you have, and strategic knowledge and cultural knowledge, multimodal text knowledge, being able to look at pictures and different kinds of things and know how to put those things together. And so when we say background knowledge, I want to make sure that we're thinking more broadly about the term knowledge and recognizing some of the different kinds of knowledge that students bring to the situation. And then the last thing I'd want to share is that we want to avoid the misconception that students can't read about a topic that they don't know anything about. And I've heard that sort of misconstrued before too. And I'll tell you that, like, you have to have background knowledge in order to understand it. Sure, but you have background knowledge about something and you just need to figure out what that is to connect to it. Because I read things all the time that I have no topic knowledge of, and I'm able to make sense of those things. And sure, what I'm making sense of and how I'm understanding is going to be different than someone who had really deep knowledge of that. But we don't want to shy away from giving students texts about things that they don't know anything about. And we want to avoid like, let's just fill them up with a whole bunch of knowledge before they read this text so they can understand it. No, they can understand it and figure out what they know already and try to connect to that rather than viewing them as vessels that we're just trying to fill.
But also the fact that you build knowledge across time. David said earlier, you know, if you have interesting topic, not only you bring, and there was a great question that I'm going, if you don't mind, we're going to go over for a little bit, but there was such a good question about independent reading that I am going to share something just as an example of the importance of independent reading within a knowledge building curricula. So for example, this is an example of unit 3, grade 3, unit 4. The topic is marine life, very cool topic. So it has to be an engaging, curious topic. And as a part of building knowledge around this as a community, right? We have different texts, different core texts that we read together. And we learn a lot, not only about the topic, but about the structure of text, how you communicate. But kids also need to learn how to marshal evidence, how to communicate it in reading and writing. And within, for example, marine life, we have several topics after kids develop this. So this is whole group, everybody's doing this together. But in addition to that, they have a chance to choose topics that they want to study more about. And they do this within a community. So if they want to study sharks or whales or penguins, they are doing this within a community and they are reading independently, but also within the community about the topic they want. We say at American Reading that reading is breathing in, writing is breathing out. At the end, we want kids to show what they can produce. So it is really important. It's a part of the equation because at the end, they need to produce a product of what they have learned, of what they have studied. I am going to finish with both of you. How do we avoid doing harm? And I'm going to give you a choice. You can answer, how do we avoid doing harm? Or what is left unsaid that you really want to say before we go? David, you're first.
Is that because I'm older?
No, because the last person that spoke was Sarah. I'm taking turns. I'm being fair.
I think what we left unsaid is the role of motivation. Two parts to motivation. When children are learning about the world, whether it's sea mammals or explorers or weather, that excites them. You know, they go home and they want to share it with their family. Very few kids want to go home and share with their family that today they learned about making predictions, and they're really psyched because next week they're going to learn about visualizing. But kids go home and talk to everybody and are motivated by learning about the world. Second, in these programs, every school that I visited for all these programs, teachers report that their kids are more motivated than they ever thought they would be, and especially their weakest readers. That was really what moved these teachers. They never thought their weakest readers would be this motivated. Why were they this motivated? Because they had been released from Fontes and Pinnell prison. Everybody was reading the same text with support, and everybody was studying the same thing. Instead of kids being put in some letter group and everybody knows who's in the high group, everybody knows who's in the low group. Instead, we're working together. We're all learning about the same thing. There's a huge motivation effect. In ARC, if you want independent validation, when I was spent a day in a school in Vermont, I went out to go to the men's room. You go there a lot when you're my age. And then these two kindergarten kids in the hallway that I thought they were going to come to blows over whether the thing crawling up the wall was an arachnid or an insect, because that's what they've been studying. That's motivation. That's knowledge. You don't get that unless you have a knowledge building curriculum that is really primed to learn about the world and primed to motivate kids. And I believe these knowledge building programs that are there have that, and ARC certainly has that.
Thank you so much. Sarah, your turn to close us off. What's left unsaid, or how do we not do harm?
I think I can answer both those questions with the same thought.
Okay, that's good.
One thing that we haven't talked a lot about are adolescents who might have foundational skills needs. And I'd say that one way that we can avoid doing harm is just taking the research base for K2 and inserting that and giving it to adolescents who have phonics fluency and phonemic awareness needs. The research base is different for older readers who have those needs. And we need to make sure that we're drawing from that research base and doing things that we know work for those older readers who have those needs. And I'd say we can avoid doing harm by not translating those findings for younger learners just into what would work for older learners.
Well, thank you so much. You have been fantastic speakers, and we have had an incredible group participating in the chat. I want to thank you for attending, but think about this. What is it going to take? Short-term solutions to big, complex problems have not worked in the past and will not work in the long run. But finding and solving problems together, talking about it, talking about the nuances, the details, it's critical. The SOR movement is a good start, but let's debate. Let's talk about the nuance. With the right mindset and insights, we will be well on our way to solving the most complex literacy problems, maybe forever. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.